Hello and welcome back to the Brit Lit Book Club. I'm your host Vanessa, and I'm absolutely delighted you've joined me for what might be one of the most fascinating behind-the-scenes stories in Victorian literature. Before we dive in, grab yourself a cup of tea if you can. I'm enjoying a nice peppermint tea this morning, which feels perfectly appropriate as we dive into the world of Victorian illustration, where artists worked by candlelight and gaslight, creating images with pen and ink that would shape how millions of readers saw the stories they loved. We've spent the last 2 episodes exploring Charles Dickens, first as the people's author and a social reformer, then diving deep into A Christmas Carol and how it transformed both Christmas celebrations and social attitudes. Today we're looking at a crucial but often overlooked part of that story, the artists who gave visual form to Dickens' words. Because here's something you might not have realized. When Victorian readers first encountered Scrooge, the Cratchit family, the 3 ghosts, and all those memorable scenes from A Christmas Carol, they didn't just imagine them in their minds. They saw them illustrated on the page by an artist named John Leech. And those images, created in a frantic collaboration between Dickens and Leech in the autumn of 1843, didn't just accompany the text, they shaped it. They defined how generations of readers would visualize Victorian Christmas. In fact, when you picture Scrooge or the Ghost of Christmas Present or Fezziwig's Ball, you're probably seeing images that originated with Leech's illustrations, even though you don't know it. This matters because Victorian novels weren't published the way books are today. Most were serialized in monthly or weekly parts, and those parts were always illustrated. The illustrations weren't decorative add-ons. They were integral to the reading experience. They set the tone, highlighted key moments, and helped readers navigate complex plots with large casts of characters, especially for Dickens books. For Dickens especially, those novels were social reform projects as much as entertainment. The illustrations were crucial. This made social critiques visual and immediate. They helped readers who might never visit London slums or workhouses see the conditions Dickens was writing about. They made abstract social problems concrete and human. So today we're exploring how John Leech created the visual vocabulary of Victorian Christmas that we still use today. We'll discover how Dickens worked with illustrators throughout his career, sometimes collaboratively, sometimes contentiously. And we'll see how these artistic partnerships shaped not just the individual books, but the entire Victorian visual imagination. Let's step into the world where word and image came together to change how culture celebrated Christmas and thought about social responsibility. Let's talk about John Leech and the first Christmas Carol. In October 1843, Charles Dickens was in a creative fever. As we discussed in our Christmas Carol episode last week, he'd just visited the Field Lane Ragged School and been horrified by the conditions he saw. He wanted to write something powerful about poverty and social responsibility, but his usual method, a long serialized novel, would take too long. He needed something immediate, something that could be published in time for Christmas and make an impact right away. So he conceived of a short Christmas book, what we'd call a novella today, and could be written quickly and published as a beautiful gift book just in time for the holiday season. This was a risky decision. Dickens was at the height of his fame. Remember, as we talked about, he was a Victorian rock star, not like Austen or the Brontes, published in obscurity. He could have commanded huge sums for another serialized novel. Instead, he decided to self-publish this Christmas book, taking on all the financial risk himself. Why? Because he had a very specific vision for how this book should look. He wanted it to be gorgeous, a book that would itself embody the Christmas spirit of generosity and beauty. He wanted gilt edges and a red gold cover, hand-colored illustrations, high-quality paper. He wanted it to be something readers would treasure and give as gifts. And he wanted the right illustrator. Enter John Leech. Now, Leech was already quite famous by 1843. He was one of the star illustrators for Punch magazine, which had been launched just 2 years earlier and was taking London by storm with its satirical cartoons and social commentary. Leech specialized in capturing middle-class Victorian life with humor and sympathy, exactly the tone Dickens needed for his story. But here's what's fascinating. Leech and Dickens were also friends. They knew each other socially, which meant Dickens could work with Leech much more collaboratively than was typical between author and illustrator at the time. Dickens didn't just hand over the completed manuscript and say, "Illustrate this." Instead, he worked closely with Leech throughout the writing process. They discussed which scenes should be illustrated, what those scenes should emphasize, even specific details of composition and character appearance. We know from Dickens' letters that he was incredibly hands-on about the illustrations. He specified that he wanted both hand-colored etchings, which were more expensive and prestigious, and black and white wood engravings. He wanted the illustrations to appear at key emotional moments in the story, not just randomly distributed through the text. Leech created 8 illustrations total, 4 full-color etchings and 4 black and white engravings, and each one was carefully chosen to capture a crucial moment in Scrooge's transformation. Let's look at what Leech illustrated and why these choices mattered. The first colored plate shows Mr. Fezziwig's ball. Remember, in our last episode, we talked about how the Fezziwig scene establishes an alternative model of capitalism, the generous employer who treats his workers like family. Leech's illustration shows us a joyous party scene, with Fezziwig and his wife leading the dance, while young Scrooge and the other apprentices celebrate around them. This image does something important. It makes generosity look fun. The Fezziwigs aren't grim philanthropists doing their duty. They're genuinely enjoying the happiness they're creating. And young Scrooge, dancing in the background, looks genuinely joyful. This visual contrast with the miserable old Scrooge makes his transformation seem both possible and desirable. The second colored plate, Scrooge's Third Visitor, shows the ghost of Christmas Present. And this image has defined how we picture this ghost ever since. Leech shows him as a giant jovial figure in a green robe trimmed with white fur, wearing a holly wreath crown, surrounded by abundance, piles of food, a glowing torch, everything suggesting plenty and generosity. This wasn't just Leech's invention. Dickens described the ghost this way in the text, but Leech's image made it concrete and memorable. When we picture Santa Claus today, and remember our modern Santa was still being invented in the 1840s, we're seeing echoes of Leech's Ghost of Christmas Present. The image also shows ignorance and want, those 2 wretched children hiding under the spirit's robe. We talked about them in our last episode. They're Dickens' personification of poverty and lack of education. Leech's illustration makes them viscerally disturbing. They're skeletal, almost inhuman, with haunted eyes. You can't look at this image and feel indifferent to child poverty. The third colored plate shows The Last of the Spirits, the ghost of Christmas yet to come, as a silent, hooded figure pointing at Scrooge's neglected grave. It's a genuinely frightening image. The ghost is almost faceless, just darkness under the hood. Scrooge is shown cowering, tiny, and powerless before the figure of death and judgment. This illustration captures the Gothic supernatural element of the story. It reminds readers that this isn't just a sentimental tale about being nice at Christmas. It's a ghost story with real stakes and genuine horror. The final colored plate is Scrooge and Bob Cratchit. The transformed Scrooge surprising Bob on Christmas morning. What's brilliant about this image is how Leech shows the power dynamic shifting. Scrooge is animated, almost dancing with generosity. Bob looks bewildered, but hopeful. The counting house, that cold, miserly place we saw at the story's beginning, is suddenly transformed by Scrooge's new spirit. The black and white engravings fill in our other key moments. Marley's ghost, the Cratchit family's Christmas dinner, Scrooge with the charitable gentleman, each one chosen to support the story's emotional and moral arc. But here's what made these illustrations so influential. They were the first images most readers saw. A Christmas Carol was phenomenally popular. Remember, it sold out its first printing by Christmas Eve, just a few days after it was published, and all those readers encountered Scrooge and the ghost through Leech's eyes first. When the story was adapted for stage, which happened almost immediately, to Dickens' great annoyance because he couldn't control the adaptations, the set designers and costume designers looked at Leech's illustrations for guidance. When other artists later illustrated the story, they often referenced Leech's original images. Leech essentially created the visual iconography of A Christmas Carol. His Ghost of Christmas Present, his vision of Victorian Christmas celebration, his depiction of transformation from miserliness to generosity, these became the template that all later versions followed. And because A Christmas Carol was so influential in shaping Victorian and modern Christmas traditions, as we discussed last week, Leech's images helped shape how we visualize Christmas itself. The abundance and generosity of family gatherings, the contrast between cold poverty and warm plenty, all of this gets visualized through the lens Leech created. The collaboration between Dickens and Leech was so successful that they worked together again on several other Christmas books, but A Christmas Carol remained their masterpiece, a perfect fusion of word and image that created something more powerful than either could have achieved alone. Let's talk about how illustrations shaped Victorian reading. To understand why illustrators like John Leech were so important to Dickens' work, we need to understand how Victorians actually read novels, and it was very different from how we read them today. As I mentioned in our first Dickens episode, most Victorian novels were published in serial form, monthly or weekly installments, that readers bought at a newsstand or received by subscription. You didn't get a complete book all at once. You got a chapter or two, printed in paper wrappers, with advertising on the back, and you waited a month for the next installment. Kind of like watching a TV show today, I guess. This created a very different reading experience. Victorian readers lived with these stories over months or years. They discussed the latest developments with their friends, speculated about what would happen next, sometimes even wrote to the authors suggesting plot directions. It was more like watching a long-running TV series than reading a novel as we think of it today. And every single installment came with illustrations. Think about what this means. When Victorian readers first encountered memorable scenes from Dickens' novels, Oliver asking for more gruel, Nancy's murder, Little Nell's death, the Marshalsea prison where Dickens' own father had been imprisoned, they saw them illustrated at the same time they read about them. The illustrations weren't something added later. They weren't bonus material for special editions. They were part of the original reading experience, as integral to the story as the words themselves. This is crucial for understanding Dickens as a social reformer. Remember in that first episode when we talked about how Dickens wanted to make the invisible visible, to show middle-class readers the realities of poverty, child labor, and industrial exploitation that they might never see in their own lives? Well, illustrations made this possible in a much more immediate way than words alone could. You could describe a ragged, starving child in words, but showing an illustration of that child made it undeniable. You couldn't look away, couldn't tell yourself it was exaggerated, couldn't maintain comfortable distance from the reality. Take Oliver Twist, published in serial from 1837 to 1839. The original illustrator was George Cruikshank, who was already famous for his satirical prints. Cruikshank's illustrations of the workhouse, of Fagin's den, of the brutal world of London's criminal underworld, these weren't decorative, they were evidence. When Dickens described the workhouse board, the officials who ran the institution where Oliver lived, as cruel and indifferent, Cruikshank showed them as fat, pompous men sneering at the thin, desperate paupers. The visual contrast between the well-fed authorities and the starving poor made Dickens' social criticism impossible to miss. Similarly, when Dickens wanted to show that Fagin's gang of child thieves weren't inherently evil, but victims of circumstance, Cruikshank's illustrations supported this reading. The boys in the picture look young and vulnerable, not like hardened criminals. You can see why they'd fall under Fagin's influence. But illustrations didn't just support the social message. They also helped manage the plot complexity. Dickens' novels have huge casts of characters and intricate plots with multiple storylines. Victorian readers getting monthly installments needed help remembering who was who and what was happening. The illustrations served as visual reminders. When a character reappeared after several installments, readers could look at the illustration and remember who they were. Important scenes were highlighted through illustration, helping readers track the main narrative threads through all the subplots. This was especially important because serialization meant that readers might have gaps of weeks or months in their reading. Life was busy in Victorian England, too. Not everyone could read installments immediately. The illustrations helped readers jump back in by visually summarizing key moments. But there was another crucial function of the illustrations. They helped sell the serials. Publishers used illustrations to market the stories, displaying them in shop windows to attract buyers. A particularly dramatic or beautiful illustration could convince someone to pick up a serial they hadn't been following. This meant illustrators had significant power over a novel's success. A poor illustration could hurt sales. A brilliant one could make the scene iconic and drive popularity. Authors like Dickens, who understood this, tried to maintain close control over the illustration process. The relationship between text and image also shaped how Victorian readers thought about reality and representation. These readers were becoming increasingly image literate. Illustrated newspapers and magazines were proliferating. Photography was just being invented. People were learning to read images as sources of information and truth. When Dickens paired his social commentary with illustrations, he was tapping into a growing visual literacy. The illustrations gave his fictional stories documentary weight. They made the fictional poverty of Oliver or the Cratchits feel like evidence of the real social conditions. This is one of the reasons why Dickens' novels were so effective as social reform literature. They combined the emotional power of fiction with the evidentiary weight of visual documentation. Readers weren't just imagining scenes, they were seeing them, which made them feel more real and more urgent. The illustrations also made Dickens' books accessible to readers with limited literacy. Not everyone in Victorian England could read fluently, but they could follow the story through the pictures. This expanded Dickens' audience and his influence beyond the fully literate middle class. For readers who could read fluently, the illustrations enriched the experience in another way. They provided a shared visual vocabulary for discussing the stories. When people talked about Oliver Twist or A Christmas Carol, they were often referring to specific illustrated scenes. The images became cultural touchstones that everyone recognized. This is why Victorian illustrators deserve much more credit than they usually get. They weren't just decorating text someone else had written. They were co-creating the cultural artifacts that shaped Victorian imagination and social consciousness. Let's talk about the relationship that Dickens had with his illustrators. Now here's where things get interesting, and sometimes contentious, because Dickens, brilliant as he was, could be incredibly difficult to work with. He had very specific ideas about how his books should look, and he wasn't shy about expressing his opinions. Let me tell you about Phiz, Hablot Knight Brown, who was Dickens' longest-serving, most important illustrator. They worked together for over 20 years, from the Pickwick Papers through A Tale of Two Cities, and their relationship was complicated. Phiz was only 20 when he started illustrating for Dickens. He'd actually replaced an earlier illustrator, Robert Seymour, who had died by suicide shortly after the Pickwick Papers began. Phiz stepped into his role with enormous talent, but also enormous pressure. He was illustrating for the most famous author in England while still learning his craft. What made Phiz so successful was his ability to understand what Dickens wanted, even when Dickens himself couldn't quite articulate it. Dickens would send him manuscript pages, often while the ink was still wet, along with extremely detailed instructions about what to illustrate and how. And I mean extremely detailed. Dickens would specify character positions, facial expressions, background details, even the angle of view. Here's a typical instruction from Dickens to Phiz about a scene in David Copperfield. I want Traddles to be sitting in his office, looking worried, papers everywhere. The shadow from the window should fall across his desk, just so, to suggest the pressure he's under. Can you imagine trying to draw from those instructions while also maintaining your own artistic vision? But Phiz was remarkably accommodating. He developed a style that perfectly complemented Dickens' writing. Detailed enough to capture all the complexity Dickens wanted, but with enough personality to be distinctively his own. His illustrations have a slightly sketchy, energetic quality that matches Dickens' prose style. More importantly, Phiz learned to read between the lines of Dickens' instructions. He understood the emotional and thematic content of scenes, not just the physical details. When Dickens wrote about the Marshalsea prison, that place his own father had been imprisoned and young Charles had visited during the traumatic period we discussed, Phiz illustrated it with genuine understanding of what that experience meant. The Marshalsea scenes in Little Dorrit are among Phiz's most powerful illustrations. He captures the psychological confinement as much as the physical. The way the prison walls press in on the characters, the gloomy shadows, the sense of being trapped, not just by walls, but by circumstance and social systems. But not all of Dickens' collaborations with illustrators were so smooth. Let me tell you about George Cruikshank, who illustrated Oliver Twist. Now, Cruikshank was a genius, one of the most famous graphic artists in England, known for his savage political satires and his ability to capture social types with brutal accuracy. But Cruikshank had a problem. He thought the pictures were more important than the words. There are documented instances where Cruikshank suggested plot developments to Dickens based on what would make good illustrations. And occasionally, Dickens actually took these suggestions, but as Cruikshank became more assertive about his role, tensions grew. Years later, Cruikshank actually claimed that he had come up with the entire plot of Oliver Twist, and that Dickens had just written it down. This was obviously ridiculous. We have all kinds of Dickens manuscripts and correspondence to prove otherwise, but it shows how seriously Cruikshank took his role as co-creator. Dickens was furious about these claims and wrote angry letters defending his authorship, but the controversy reveals something important. The line between author and illustrator in Victorian publishing was often blurry. Illustrators were expected to be creative partners, not just servants carrying out orders. This is actually one reason why Dickens eventually started exerting more control over the illustration process. After the Cruikshank controversy, he became even more specific in his instructions to his illustrators. He wanted to maintain clear authorship while still getting the visual support he needed. The relationship with Marcus Stone, who illustrated Our Mutual Friend, shows how this played out. Stone was young and relatively inexperienced when Dickens hired him. This meant Dickens could shape his approach more completely. The illustrations of Our Mutual Friend are gorgeous, highly detailed, and totally faithful to Dickens' vision, but they also lack some of the interpretive energy that Fizz brought to his work. There's always this tension in collaborative art. Too much of control from one party limits creativity, but too little coordination creates chaos. Dickens, with his intense need for control, shaped by that childhood of trauma at Warren's Blacking that we discussed, tended toward being overly controlling. But his best illustrators, particularly Fizz and Leech, found ways to work within that control while still bringing their own artistry. What's important to understand is that these weren't just business relationships. These were artistic partnerships that shaped how millions of readers experienced these stories. When we remember Dickens' novels today, we're often remembering images these artists created as much as the words Dickens wrote. Let's return to where we started. John Leech and A Christmas Carol, because the legacy of those illustrations extends far beyond one book. When Leech illustrated the Ghost of Christmas Present as a jolly giant in green robes, surrounded by abundance, he was helping to create our modern iconography of Christmas generosity. That image fed into the developing figure of Father Christmas and Santa Claus, figures that were being consolidated from various traditions from the 1840s and 50s. When he showed the Cratchit family gathered around their modest Christmas feast, he was defining what proper Victorian Christmas celebration should look like. Family together, humble but joyful, making the most of what they have with gratitude and love. When he depicted Fezziwig's ball, he was showing that Christmas generosity isn't just about charity to the poor. It's about employers treating workers with dignity and including them in celebration. That image has shaped how we think about workplace relationships and social responsibility. But it wasn't just Leech. Throughout the 1840s and 1850s, Victorian illustrators were creating the visual vocabulary of Christmas that we still use today. Punch magazine, where Leech worked, published elaborate Christmas illustrations every year. These images showed Christmas celebrations across different social classes, establishing templates for everything from decorating Christmas trees to caroling to gift-giving. The Illustrated London News, launched in 1842, made visual journalism popular. Their Christmas issues featured elaborate engravings of holiday celebrations, spreading ideas about the proper Christmas observance across the country and eventually across the English-speaking world. What these illustrators were doing, often in collaboration with writers like Dickens, was creating a shared visual culture around Christmas. Before the 1840s, Christmas celebrations varied wildly by region, class, and family tradition. After the 1840s, there was an increasingly standard Victorian Christmas that everyone recognized and tried to emulate. This standardization happened largely through images. People saw illustrations of how the middle class celebrated Christmas and wanted to recreate those scenes in their own homes. They saw images of generosity and charity and felt social pressure to be generous and charitable themselves. And crucially, these images were reproducible. The same illustration could appear in publications across the country, creating a genuinely shared visual experience. When everyone saw the same images of Christmas celebrations, they began to celebrate Christmas in increasingly similar ways. This is one of the ways that illustration contributed to creating national culture. Before mass visual media, different regions and communities would remain quite distinct in their customs and traditions, but illustrated publications helped create shared cultural references that unified the nation. The Victorian Christmas that Leech and other illustrators helped create, and that Dickens' writing promoted, spread beyond England to America, Australia, and other English-speaking countries. Those images traveled, adapted to local contexts, but retained their core visual vocabulary. When we decorate for Christmas today, when we see picture scenes from A Christmas Carol, when we imagine Dickensian London at Christmas with its snow and holly and festive abundance, we're seeing through the eyes that Victorian illustrators trained. They created the template we still use today. So, why does all of this matter today, in our age of digital media and moving images? Because it reminds us that stories are always multimedia experiences. The tension between words and images, between author and illustrator, between what's written and what's shown, these tensions are still with us, just in different forms. When a novel gets adapted into a film or TV series, we're still navigating the same questions the Victorians did. How faithful should the visual interpretation be to the written text? Who has authority over the story, the writer or the visual creator? How do images shape how we understand the narrative? Think about how much debate there is when beloved books get adapted. Fans argue about the casting choices, about how scenes are visualized, about what gets emphasized or left out. We're having the same conversations Dickens had with his illustrators, just at a larger scale and in different media. The Victorian experience also reminds us that accessibility matters. Illustrations made Dickens stories available to readers with limited literacy. Today, we have audiobooks, large print editions, screen readers, and other accessibility tools that serve similar functions, making stories available to a wider audience than just proficient readers. And the collaboration between Dickens and his illustrators offers lessons for any creative partnership. They need to balance control with creative freedom, the importance of shared vision, the challenge of coordinating different artistic disciplines. These are timeless issues in collaborative art. If today's exploration of Dickens and his illustrators has inspired you to delve deeper, I've got some wonderful recommendations for you. For Understanding Victorian Illustration, Michael Steig's Dickens and Fizz is the definitive study of Dickens' longest collaboration with detailed analysis of how the illustrations shaped the novel's meaning. Jane R. Cohen's Charles Dickens and His Original Illustrators covers all of Dickens' illustrators and their various styles and contributions. For John Leech specifically, Simon Hauff's John Leech and the Victorian Scene explores Leech's work beyond Dickens, showing how he captured Victorian life. For Christmas traditions, Lee Eric Schmidt's Consumer Rights, The Buying and Selling of American Holidays explores how Victorian Christmas became commercialized and standardized, with illustrations playing a key role. And if you want to see some of these illustrations for yourself, you can head to my website at thebookclubtour.com/Dickens Illustrators. And if you want to see some of these beautiful Victorian Christmas scenes for yourself, you can join us in 2027 for a Christmas book club tour. Just head to our website, thebookclubtour.com, or social media at thebookclubtour. Well, my tea's getting cold, so until next time, keep reading and stay curious.